really? Oh, I was thinking it was longer. Okay, you can talk faster. Let me just give you a quick thing on what Matthew's saying. When you think of Jews, of Jewish people, you think of what you see on the news where they've got the locks and the beards and the hats and all that, right? For the most part. And Jewishness is sort of twofold. There's the religion of Judaism, and there are Jews. So in other words, there are German Jews and Romanian Jews and Israeli Jews and American Jews. Depending on where you're from, you can say, I'm Italian. But if I'm from the seed of Abraham, if I'm from that lineage, then I'm an Italian Jew. Now, my father was a Romanian Jew. He actually lived in Romania, and when Hitler was coming to power, his mother smuggled her and the 6 kids through the Holland Underground, and they came to Ellis Island and saw the Statue of Liberty for the first time, and they came to America. When my father was 14 years old, and he grew up and moved to Israel, and actually lived in Israel for 3 years, but he lived there prior to 1967, so he was never there when Jerusalem was part of Israel. He died in 66, so he was in June of 66, and Israel took back Jerusalem in June of 67, so he missed it by 1 year. My mother was actually Italian, but my mother converted to Judaism. And the reason she did that is that she wanted to make sure, they wanted to make sure that we were full Jews. Prior to the Jews being taken away to Babylon, remember King Nebuchadnezzar? Not sure how much you guys know, but remember King Nebuchadnezzar? In 586 BC, they destroyed the temple and took the Jews away. 70 years later, they came back. Prior to that time, a Jew was considered a Jew as long as at least his father was Jewish. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, right? After that, with the Jewish women being, taken away and raped and all those things, it was like, how do we know the descendancy of the father? We don't sometimes, but we'll always know who the mother is. So therefore, they changed it. In what's called rabbinical Judaism, it was through the mother. So even though my father was a Jew of a Jew of a Jew, my mother needed to convert to Judaism to make sure that we were born Jews and had that lineage. Okay? When you are practicing Judaism, that is also considered being Jewish. But today, and this is kind of controversial a little bit, but today, Jews don't practice the teachings of Moses through the Pentateuch, okay, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. They rely more on, not the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, they rely on the Talmud. The Talmud was what the Pharisees and Sadducees we read about in the Bible, they wrote all this explanation of what the scriptures meant, okay? Because, again, they've been taken captive for 70 years. That's, who's one of the oldest people you know? Probably around 70 years old, right? So this whole generation went by without knowing the teachings of Moses. And so the Pharisees and Sadducees, they came along and they wrote the Talmud to explain everything. And when Jesus came on earth, you know how he always came against the religious leaders? He was coming against their teachings. He never came against the teachings of Moses or the prophets. He came against their teachings because their teachings is what heaped on more and more and more law beyond what God had said. Okay? So I digress for just a minute, but I'll give you a little history there. So, if you're like me, you read in the Bible, in the Old Testament, all about the Jews and in Israel, right? And then you read in the New Testament where Jesus comes, and where is Jesus? Jesus is in Israel. And then you pick up the paper, you turn on the news today, and you hear about what's going on with the Jews in Israel. So you have this concept that almost from the beginning of time, the Jews have been in Israel. Does anybody have a different mindset than that the Jews have just always been there? Is that what you believe? You can nod like, yeah, all right. Okay. Well, honestly, that's what I believe. I started going to the Jewish schools in Staten Island in 1965. And right away, one of the first things we did was we had these little jars that looked like Band-Aid jars. They had a little slit on them, Jewish flag on the front of it, Israeli flag, and we would bring pennies to school to plant trees in Israel. I never thought about it. I just thought, well, we always bring pennies to school and we plant trees in Israel. This was in 1965. Well, the reason is that the Jews were there in the Bible, and they were there all the way through the Bible. But if you remember, at the end, when Jesus was crucified, do you remember when Jesus was looking over Jerusalem and he starts to weep and says, oh, if I could just gather you together like a hen gathers her chicks, but you will be destroyed. Remember when Jesus said that? Well, Jesus died in 33 AD. By 70 AD, what cried about came true. The Romans had basically attacked Jerusalem, and they destroyed Jerusalem. And they destroyed the temple again. And the Jews were dispersed. Now, around 132, this guy by the name of Bar Kokhba, he started another revolt, like the last revolt against the Romans. But they were defeated. And so, from the year 70 AD, all the way to like 1800s, for like 1800 years, there were no Jews, except for a small remnant of Jews in Jerusalem. Isn't that weird to think about? We always think because we read history and we know today that there was no gap. But there was almost a 2,000-year gap where the Jews were dispersed to the four corners of the earth, as the Bible prophesied they would be. So let me just give you a quick little history lesson about what happened during those 1800 years. Now, one thing I want to point out here. This is Israel, okay? Israel, this is Israel today. Israel before was a whole lot bigger, okay? If you read the borders in the Bible, you've picked up Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. All of this was all Israel. But, and we'll go into it in a little bit, but this little piece of Israel here, it doesn't represent 1% of the Middle East. It represents 1/6 of 1%. So when you hear in the news about Israel giving away their land for peace, think about it. Wait a minute, these guys only have 1/6 of 1%. Why do they have to give up their land for peace? Just to give you the proper perspective. And then, look at Jerusalem. See that little dot right there? You wouldn't think that it would be so sought after. But let me tell you what happened to Jerusalem over the last 2,000 years. You ready? First of all, in 1000 BC, that's 3,000 years ago, King David captured Jerusalem and took it as his capital. He'd been a king for about 7.5 years. Hebron, that was his place, but he wanted Jerusalem. So 3,000 years ago, it became the capital of the Jewish state, the country. And then after he died, Solomon, his son, had it. And then, as I told you, in 586 BC, that's when Persia, which is modern-day Iran, isn't that ironic, because we're hearing about Iran in the news? Back then, Iran came, or Persia came, and took it over, and they were there for 70 years, and Persia ran it. Then they were let free, they rebuilt their temple again, and then this Hellenistic, they called it, rule came in. In other words, you've heard about Alexander the Great? Okay, well, Alexander the Great came in, and the Greeks, they broke them up into 4 generals, and they came and they captured Jerusalem. Okay, so that little dot there, after the Persian rule, then it became the Greek rule. Well, there was this one guy that decided what he was going to do is he was going to sacrifice a pig in that Holy of Holies, in that temple. And there was a guy by the name of Judas of Maccabee. And he said, enough is enough. And they started a revolt. And they captured back their temple. And they defeated the Greeks. This little band of Jews defeated the Greeks. They took back their temple. Now, you know around Christmas time in Jewish homes you see menorahs. You see those candlesticks with the lights. Okay, that's called the Festival of Lights. That is celebrating and commemorating the fact that Israel took back the temple back then in like 167. Okay? About 167 years before Jesus came. That's why it's in the Bible that Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. All right? So it was the Hashemons who were the people that took it back, and so they had a very short rule. And then the Roman Empire comes, and they defeat it. Okay? So that's when we read about Jesus. Jesus came during the time that the Romans were there. Well then, after the Romans, then there was a Greek revolt again in Jerusalem, and the Bar Kokhba, which I told you about. And then the Byzantine Empire came in. And now if you go to Jerusalem, you see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you see the Beatitudes place, you see the teardrop place where Jesus wept over. And there's all these very, I don't want to put them down, but gaudy is probably the best word for them. There's these very, ornate, very Catholic-looking buildings that are there today, and that's during that Byzantine Empire, when that came in. And then, around 600 years after Jesus, comes the Muslims. Apparently, Muhammad had a dream or a vision, and in the dream, Moses is there, and Jesus is there, and Abraham is there, and they're standing on top of the mount where the temple was, where Abraham offered